Well, good morning, everyone. This morning, the government of Saskatchewan has launched a constitutional reference case against the Trudeau carbon tax. We have asked the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal a clear question on the constitutionality of the legislation the federal government has introduced to impose the carbon tax. The question we are asking is, the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act was introduced into Parliament on March the 28th, 2018 as Part 5 of Bill C-74. If enacted, will this act be unconstitutional in whole or in part? Provinces are not subsidiaries of the federal government. We do not believe the federal government has the constitutional right to impose this carbon tax on Saskatchewan industries, jobs, and families. In short, the federal government is trying to impose a carbon tax on some provinces, but not others, based on how each province has chosen to exercise its legislative jurisdiction. This does not make sense, according to our Canadian Constitution. It fails to respect the sovereignty and autonomy of the provinces with respects to matters under their jurisdiction. Saskatchewan should not be subject to this tax simply because the Trudeau Liberals do not like our climate change plan. Overwhelmingly, Saskatchewan people do not support the Trudeau carbon tax. We believe that there is a better way to meet the challenge of climate change without doing irreparable harm to our economy. We have a Made in Saskatchewan plan, a plan to reduce emissions, a plan that does not include a carbon tax. And our plan is called Prairie Resilience. It builds on the good work that has been done in our province for years, with good results. In Saskatchewan, our greenhouse gas emissions intensity has declined 8.8% between the years of 2005 to 2016, all the while our GDP has increased by some 22%. Our government has committed to doubling our renewable power to 50% of SaskPower's generating capacity. We're adding renewable capacity, and we're looking at the potential of geothermal. We've invested more than $1.3 billion in a carbon capture and storage project, Boundary Dam 3. At Boundary Dam 3, they've captured more than 2 million tons of carbon dioxide. This is the equivalent of taking 500,000 vehicles off the road. Saskatchewan is a world leader in carbon capture technology, which the International Energy Agency and the United Nations say is crucial if the world is to meet emissions reductions objectives. On the regulatory side, we're developing sector-by-sector emission standards, and we think this is a smarter approach than a blanket carbon tax. We're drawing up regulations specific to our upstream oil and gas industry that will reduce emissions by 40 to 45%. And we're devising an offset system which will recognize Saskatchewan's importance as a carbon sink. The adoption of zero-till technology, which Saskatchewan has helped pioneer, combined with increased pulse acreage, has essentially made agriculture in Saskatchewan carbon neutral. This should be acknowledged by our federal government. And so should Saskatchewan's uranium exports, which are used to generate emissions-free nuclear power in places such as China and South Korea. Saskatchewan's uranium offsets an estimated 350 million tons of emissions in the world each and every year. Our government's climate change strategy is comprehensive, it is innovative, and it recognizes the reality of our province. It's an approach that will result in actual emission reductions, not only within the borders of Saskatchewan, not only within our nation of Canada, but throughout the world. Our constitutional challenge asserts that the provincial government, not the federal government, has the constitutional authority to set our policy in this area. As I said, provinces are not subsidiaries of the federal government, and in Saskatchewan, we have a plan. Our plan reduces emissions without a carbon tax. If there are any questions, we'd be happy to answer those.
Mr. Morgan, can you speak more specifically on the nature of the challenge and how it impedes Saskatchewan to exercise its own legislative jurisdiction from a constitutional standpoint? Specifically, what are we being, specifically what and how are we being impeded?
We, the way Bill C-74 is structured is it allows listed provinces to be charged a different rate, which we feel is not in the spirit of any form of federalism. We recognize the federal government's right to levy a tax, but the intention of Bill C-74 is to levy a different rate on different provinces depending on the federal government's view of the province's level of support for their particular climate change plan. We think that that breaches any sense of common federalism, and that would certainly be one of the major thrusts of our argument.
So if it's uniformity tax across the board for every province and territory, then you guys wouldn't have much of a legal challenge at that point?
If there was a totally uniform rate such as GST, it would be a different argument, but that is not the way this is structured.
Uniformity, the Ottawa has been very clear, like to meet their standards, like the 2018-19 route $10 a ton, going up to $50 a ton in 2022. Is that not uniformity when they're saying that either you hit these standards in your plan or we impose?
I can speak. The fact of the matter is there are 4 to 5 provinces that are not meeting the uniformity that the federal government has or has not put forward. The outlier, we are the outlier here because we did not sign on to the Pan-Canadian framework, and the reason we did not sign on is because of the wording in that framework with respect to carbon taxation. The previous premier did sign on to the Vancouver Declaration, which stated that provinces across this nation and territories would do what they could do to contribute to Canada's commitments in the Paris Accord, understanding the differences that we may contribute across the nation of Canada. So we did not sign on to the Pan-Canadian framework, and we have been, the attempt is there to exclude us from the infrastructure funding and low carbon economy fund, which I've indicated that we will be applying for. And this is the basis, is that lack of uniformity across the nation, that we'll be launching this constitutional this reference case to our provincial court of appeal, as we believe that this is contrary to the principles of federalism or cooperative federalism here in the nation of Canada.
If the rate is similar, where is the lack of uniformity? If every province is being charged the same per ton rate, where is the lack of uniformity that you point to? Every province is being charged a $10 rate, accelerating to $50, I believe. So where is the lack of uniformity specifically?
No, go ahead if you're ready.
Yeah. The rate is not similar. The rate is different, and the imposing the federal backstop, which is different than other provinces across the nation. The rate is not similar across the nation, and the federal government has chosen where they will impose their federal backstop. And what we're saying is this is unconstitutional, and we're putting the reference case to the provincial court of appeal. The analogy or the comparison that we would use is, for example, a consumption tax across the nation of Canada. Let's say that the federal government wanted to equalize the consumption taxes across the nation, so they would increase their GST by 5% in the province of Alberta, where they did not have a consumption tax. That would be a similar argument that would be put forward in that case under the Constitution.
What's the next step, depending on what happens with this answer?
The process from here, if that's your question, is the application was filed early this morning with the Saskatchewan Court of Appeal. We thereafter serve it on the federal government's representatives. It goes to the Court of Appeal, who will allow a reasonable period of time for interveners to come forward. We anticipate there will be a number of them, other provinces, other jurisdictions. It would be heard by the Court of Appeal sometime later this year. Depending on the outcome of that, there may or may not be a further appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada.
How much is this going to cost?
We're using our staff lawyers at this point in time, so it's people that are working for us right now. No doubt there's a cost to do this, but right now we're doing it internally.
Sorry, go ahead.
Sir.
I would just say, further to Adam's question, so that's the process on the legal side. With respect to the regulatory side, our work continues. We've had consultations over the last 2 months with over 100 organizations. That includes industrial stakeholders, companies, municipalities, universities, and others. We're going to continue to develop our performance standards. We're going to continue to develop our resiliency measurements and the targets. So that work doesn't end. What we've indicated to the federal government is that we have a plan that is going to see regulations that will see reductions in our emissions. If this is really about emissions, the federal government hasn't been able to demonstrate to date, and in fact, this was a debate in Ottawa, I think last week. They haven't indicated what a carbon tax will actually do in terms of reducing emissions. So if this is really about emissions, then Saskatchewan's putting forward a very credible plan that will achieve the same or more in terms of emission reductions. So I think the federal government needs to answer the question, is this about emissions reductions or is it about a tax?
And further to that, with respect to the cost of this, we are using the constitutional branch of our Ministry of Justice, and I would say that we will put the full weight of our Ministry of Justice, the Government of Saskatchewan, and the constitutional branch within the Ministry of Justice behind this effort and behind this case. And we must also remember the cost to the economy if we were to stand by idly and allow this cost to be on the economic growth of our province of Saskatchewan, understanding the industries that we have here in energy and agriculture and mining, in manufacturing, as well as the cost to jobs and families across the province. And we continue, as Minister Duncan has eloquently stated, to have the wrong conversation about taxing our industries and taxing our residents across the nation and in the province of Canada, and the cost of what that would be, versus having an actual conversation around what we can do to further emissions reductions, to enhance sequestration opportunities that we have in agriculture and in carbon capture and storage, and enhance opportunities that we have in all sorts of renewables and that type of effort. So we continue to have the wrong policy conversation around taxing our industries, a policy that on its own has not worked to reduce emissions anywhere across this nation or around the world.
But if it is a tax, and you argue that they have the right to tax as a federal government, it all comes down to the issue of consumption and Saskatchewan having a higher rate of consumption versus other areas perhaps. So isn't that in essence the thrust of the constitutional challenge? The problem is we have a higher rate of consumption and that you guys don't particularly want that because you're being taxed on that?
No, essentially the challenge is we are an export-based economy here in the province, and it puts us at a severe competitive disadvantage in the industries that we have. And I would put forward this example that crosses over to any industries. We have a steel plant north of the city of Regina here that emits 5 times less than many of the steel plants around the world by the technology that they use in an electric arc furnace versus a blast furnace. If we were to tax that industry, they quite likely may move to another jurisdiction of the world or another country in the world, and they'll open a blast furnace as just as likely, and they will emit 5 times the emissions that they currently do today. Regina and Saskatchewan, I would put forward, will lose those jobs, and the world will have a higher emissions profile. This is the wrong conversation that we continue to have about taxing our industries that are sustainable when you compare them to other areas of the world. It's the wrong policy directive that the federal government has taken, and that's why we're taking the stand that we have here today on behalf of the people of this province.
Is there a similarity between what you're fighting here and what BC's arguing on the pipelines in regards to federal jurisdiction and who has the right in those cases? I don't know if the Premier or the Justice Minister wants to answer.
Well, I won't speak to what British Columbia may or may not move forward with in the days ahead, but any similarity would be the Constitution. And as I said, this province is not subsidiary to the federal government in the governance of our natural resources. In the case of Kinder Morgan, pipelines, rail lines, and ports have always been under the federal government's jurisdiction, and they continue to be. Some of the most unifying construction projects in our nation have been just those types of infrastructure projects that allow us as an exporting nation to have access to some 150 plus countries each and every year. The question that we need to answer as a nation is it British Columbia's coast or is it Canada's coast? And I would put forward that as a very important question, and that it is Canada's coast.
Is the expectation to have a decision on this before or after the legislation passes in Ottawa?
Our goal would be that we would like to have a decision from the Court of Appeal. The proposed target for the federal tax is the beginning of next year. It would be desirable to have that in place prior to that tax coming in force.
And what are you expecting in terms of interveners, if anything?
We don't know what other provinces would come in. It's up to the court to make a decision who to allow or who not to allow. The other provinces come in as a matter of right if they choose to. But you might have some industry groups. You might have some municipalities that might be affected. But we're assuming other provinces for certain.
You're assuming other provinces?
We're assuming some other provinces would.
I would put.
Yeah. That would delay the process, yeah.
No, it's certainly somebody could ask for additional time. Our goal is we would like to have a decision from the Court of Appeal by the end of the calendar year. The time period should be acceptable for somebody to be able to assemble their argument or put forward. As you're likely aware, it's a legal argument. Evidence does not need to be called, so it's a matter of somebody writing a brief, being prepared to argue the brief, and the timing that's available within the Court of Appeal.
You guys viewing it as a tax and the federal government calling it carbon pricing that stays within the jurisdiction that it's implied or proposed?
I think that gets down to the semantics of what it looks like. You'd reference the different prices that were charged in the backstop, but the federal government has said to different jurisdictions, you do whatever you want. If we think it's okay, we're going to let you do it. We don't think that's a tax. That's some other that's another vehicle. That's another method of doing something different. A tax is simply a tax. The GST has got a fixed rate all the way across Canada. It's clear. It's unambiguous. For them to do something where there's a variety of different things that are available for different provinces based on their approval of certain other methods is something that we think does not fall within the federal ability to tax, and is not consistent with any form of federalism. So
we've put forward a broad question to the Court of Appeal, and the details and the arguments will come forward within that due process. And we feel we're putting forward a strong case, and we're looking for a positive outcome at the time that there will be a ruling on this. In the case of intervener status across this nation, this is a conversation that I'm certain provinces will have, as we now see a federal government that is treating one jurisdiction different than another, not only in the imposition of this backstop, but also in the willingness to withhold capital infrastructure dollars that I might add that we will utilize to achieve the emissions reductions that we're making every effort to achieve in the energy industry, as well as in our electrical generation industry and other industries that we have through our plan for prairie resilience. And those are attempted to be withheld from the province of Saskatchewan, which I would put forward could be very concerning for many provinces when you have a federal government that is willing to do that in this case of explicit provincial jurisdiction is in our opinion, that the federal government may also be willing to utilize those same tactics in other areas of most notable provincial jurisdiction as well. And you may see some provinces have that in their consideration of intervening in this specific case.
Interveners, is there any set timeline yet for how long they have to potentially hop onto this case? Is that 2 months, or is that too early at this point?
The court could allow additional time. Usually they would say you have to you would have to apply or give notice to court within a month. The court could grant a different timeline should they choose to, but usually it's done within a month.
And just, in case this this question, in case it's not successful for Saskatchewan, is there a plan B? I know the consultation is still going on with prairie resilience and setting those targets, but is there also some of the delay in setting some of those targets just in case Saskatchewan does have to modify the plan to also deal with a federal carbon tax being imposed?
So with respect to this, we feel we're putting forward a strong case, and we feel we'll be successful with the case that with the opportunities for the arguments that we are putting forward. In saying that, we're fully prepared to see this through to the Supreme Court of Canada. In saying all of that, We continue to have the wrong conversation. We continue to have a conversation about how best to tax industries across the nation and not having the conversation about how we can enhance emissions reductions as well as enhance the opportunities and recognize the opportunities for carbon sequestration in our soils, our forests, in carbon capture and storage, for instance. And we need to continue to talk about what actually matters here, and that's our carbon content in our atmosphere, as opposed to having this jurisdictional discussion over who can tax and when.
In terms of the taxation itself, the feds have said that the provinces and territories can do what they want with the revenues. So you in essence can give 100% of that tax back to industry and still putting the onus on provinces who don't keep up on climate change initiatives. That's what the essence of what the feds are wanting to do, is put the pressure on the provinces to do something about climate change. So isn't that, what's wrong with, in your view, then what's wrong with that?
So I would say first, it goes back to the Vancouver Declaration, which the province of Saskatchewan signed. The Vancouver Declaration spoke to ensuring that there was fairness and flexibility for provinces to design their own climate change plans that took into account the differences and the variations in our economies, the fact that we're all coming from different starting points. Saskatchewan's been blessed with having an abundant supply of cheap coal for many decades, whereas next door in Manitoba, they've had hydropower and have been less reliant on coal. And so Vancouver spoke specifically to recognizing the fact that we're all at different starting points in this conversation. The fact of the matter of the federal government indicating that while the province can choose to put in their own carbon tax, or the federal government will impose a carbon tax, the federal government have not been able to demonstrate what the carbon tax will actually do in terms of emission reductions. Some of the federal documents that have been released through FOIs, but they've been heavily redacted, have indicated that a $10 to $50 per ton carbon tax won't actually reduce emissions. It's not high enough to actually change behavior. If the point of a carbon tax is to change behavior so that people will make different decisions that will reduce carbon emissions, then their own documents suggest that the carbon tax isn't high enough. So if the point of all of this is emissions reductions, the federal government's plan simply is inadequate. That's why we've put forward our own plan that we believe will achieve the same, if not better results than the federal government. And again, we still don't have an answer from the federal government as to why that would not be acceptable. If we can demonstrate a plan in Saskatchewan that takes into account the fact that Saskatchewan, our cropland soils alone, leaving aside grasslands, leaving aside forestry, leaving aside wetlands, our cropland alone sequester 12 million tons of carbon a year. We're at 75 million in terms of our emissions, but if we don't even take into account the fact that we naturally sequester 12 million tons just in cropland alone, a carbon tax doesn't take into account any of that. And so if this is really about science, then you have to take into account the full picture. A carbon tax doesn't do that. And I think when we leave aside the positive benefits of Saskatchewan, our natural benefits, the fact that we're a natural soil, a carbon sink, it's really people are denying science. And I think that that's only tells half the story when you only look at one policy tool like a carbon tax, which we believe is ineffective for Saskatchewan.
Got time for about two more questions here.
Follow up to that, Minister Duncan.
Yep.
You said that Saskatchewan signed on to the Vancouver Declaration. The Declaration also calls on provinces and territories to examine a price on carbon. So when you guys signed on to that, it's indicating that you're aware that a carbon price may be imminent or maybe forthcoming, so that you should be preparing for that. So how do you respond?
That's correct. Sorry, Bernie.
I would just say that's exactly what we were doing in Montreal when the Prime Minister rose to his feet and introduced this carbon backstop on the people across the nation of Canada, was examining opportunities that we had on the 4 pillars that came out of the Vancouver Declaration. So it was imposed at a time when we were undergoing as environment ministers the work that we were asked to do by our First Ministers and the Prime Minister across the nation. Do you have anything to add?
And I would just add to that, so as a part of our plan, we're going to put forward performance standards for our heavy emitters in the province. What we want to provide is as much flexibility in terms of achieving that compliance. And one of those options will be paying into a technology fund, which will, we will set what that amount will be for companies that are out of compliance. But again, that is different than the federal government saying you shall have a carbon tax, and if you don't have one at a price that we will designate, then we'll impose one on you. Our plan is made in Saskatchewan. It's made in consultation with the people of Saskatchewan, with industries, with a number of stakeholder groups. Well over 100 have been consulted so far. And it will have the ability for us to, for industry to achieve compliance in having as much flexibility as we can allow that will balance off ensuring that we are seeing reductions in emissions while also ensuring that we're not harming the economy.
There's been a lot of heated rhetoric around this for like 18 months now, and the courts seem like an appropriate place to settle it. But I'm wondering, just given that, why is this still being characterized as a challenge? You're challenging the federal government's ability to do this.
The federal government has just recently introduced the bill. So, I mean, it's been, the discussion point has gone on for a period of time. And as Minister Duncan had mentioned, we're putting forward real, valid options and demonstrating an ability to reduce carbon. So we're going through that process, and then the federal government has now introduced Bill C-74. If that bill passes, as I expect it to as a budget bill, then we'll have to go forward. So I think you're exactly right that the place to resolve it is in the courts, and we want to put forward what we believe is a very strong argument, and we have every confidence that our lawyers will be successful.
It is interesting that this bill is included in a budget bill, and there may be an opportunity for the Senate or otherwise to remove that from the actual budget bill and allow this bill have ample debate in our federal government through the Senate and the House on the bill itself exclusively. But that doesn't appear to be the case thus far. But it may happen as we move forward.
Is it the government's position that emissions are in the province's jurisdiction or the federal government? Like, what's your feeling on that?
The governance of our natural resources has always been under the provincial jurisdiction. That's been proven time and time again, and that remains so.
Would that include emissions though? Because me driving my car around, that puts some emissions into the atmosphere, but it's not 100% related to the.
And this is the discussion that we need to continue to have: is how we can all do better across the nation when it comes to reducing our emissions, looking for opportunities to sequester more carbon in our soils or through carbon capture and storage. A carbon tax does none of that. It's been proven time and time again that it has not been responsible for the reduction of actual emissions around the world. What it is responsible for is moving jobs and emissions to areas of the world that do not charge it.
Was that one
Obliged to hear this case? Is the Court of Appeals obliged to hear your case? Unlike the Court of Appeal in Ottawa, the Supreme Court that has some jurisdiction?
It's not an application for leave. It's an application to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal could defer it and say we're not hearing it because we think the Supreme Court would be an option, but we don't think that's likely. We've started the action here. There's no other action pending. Our expectation is that the Court of Appeal would hear it here. We're not anticipating that they would decline to hear it.
To Ryan in the back.
Just a couple quick questions. I know you've warned the federal government for a while that you would take some extra steps if need be. Did you have any sort of conversations with your federal counterparts before you decided to go this route today?
We've had discussions with them about our intents throughout my time in this position. Minister Duncan, Minister Morgan as well have had those discussions over the last number of months and even over a year now as well. And we continue to have those discussions as we move forward. We will always have discussions about how we can do better in Saskatchewan and export that knowledge and that technology that we have so that we can have an impact in actual emissions reductions and actual opportunities to sequester carbon, to reduce that carbon content in our atmosphere with anyone that is willing to have those discussions with us, because we feel what we have in the way of the innovation that Minister Duncan had spoken about in agriculture, in ensuring that our crop agriculture, never mind our forestry and our grasslands, but our crop agriculture is essentially carbon neutral. Carbon capture and storage is part of the way forward in reducing our carbon content in the atmosphere. This is the way that we feel that Saskatchewan, and I would put forward Canada, has a great opportunity to impact the global conversation around climate change, and that is important to us in this province, and we're willing to have that conversation. The conversation we're not willing to have is around an ineffective policy that does not reduce emissions and taxes the jobs and the industries and the families in our province.
Just to follow up to that, the $62 million that that federal government was going to offer should provinces sign on. You said you were still going to apply for it regardless of the fact. This announcement today, does it change anything about that?
We are still going to apply for that because we are still part of this great nation, and Minister Duncan will answer to the specifics.
Yeah, I would just follow on the comments of the Premier to say that we are absolutely going to apply for those dollars. And frankly, we're going to put forward some projects that I think it will be hard for the federal government to turn down, projects that will actually see reductions in methane emissions, projects that will see people in this province move from diesel power and electricity when it comes to heating their homes and moving to natural gas. That's something that the federal government have talked, that's an important priority for the federal government to see, particularly northern Canadians, Canadians living in remote areas, move away from the reliance on diesel, largely diesel, but in Saskatchewan there's a lot of electricity being used to heat homes. Certainly that came up in the legislature here earlier this spring, and so we're going to submit as a part of our proposals a project that would see natural gas delivered to, which would be an emissions reduction project. So we're gonna apply for the dollars as if we're as we are a part of this country, and you know, let the federal government answer as to why we shouldn't access those dollars that will actually reduce emissions. Again, if this is about emissions reductions, then we should be looking at Saskatchewan's plan and not a carbon tax, and the federal government should be looking at the projects that we're going to put forward, because there will be projects that will actually reduce emissions.
That concludes our time here today. Thanks so much for coming, everyone. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.